Right. I'm David Merrill, the president of US-Indonesia Society, USINDO. I want to welcome all the people who turned out on this nice summer afternoon in person, as well as the many, many who are watching online and others who will watch the video because they're in a different time zone. This is a special open forum called Whither, Indonesia, a perspective from one of Australia's most distinguished and experienced diplomats, Ambassador John McCarthy. He'll talk on Australia's perspective on Indonesia, its past, present, and future, something that we think about far too little. Our program will be moderated by our USINDO U.S. co-chair, Ambassador Bob Blake. I want to also thank Helen Jessup, our corporate secretary, one of the founding members of USINDO, who's, I think, formerly an Australian, who helped us find John and make him an informal member of our advisory board. But this is his first appearance. We don't think often enough about Australia, its close relationship with Indonesia, and how that relates to the United States, both historically and with respect to current global issues. Today, we're going to try to remedy that. John McCarthy was an Australian ambassador to 7 countries, to Indonesia from 1997 to 2000, the period covering the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia's transition to democracy, and the Timor independence issue. Previously, he had been ambassador to Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, and the United States. And after Indonesia, he served as ambassador to Japan and high commissioner to India. So he hasn't missed much of the very important countries. He has an MA and LLB from Cambridge University. He will trace Australia's often turbulent relationship with Indonesia and the good times as well, and give an Australian view of Indonesia's future regional and global role. Will it be what has sometimes been termed a small, big country, or will it live up to its potential? Bob Blake will moderate, and after the speech part, Bob will moderate a Q&A session, first from our in-person audience, and then, if time permits, from the online audience. Virtual attendees can type in their questions at any time in the Zoom chat box. Bob?
Help on the Zoom side, but thank you, David. Let me add my own warm words of welcome to everybody this afternoon, including to all of our online watchers. And I also want to add my own very warm words of welcome to a very old friend, John McCarthy. I first met John when I was a much more junior diplomat in India. I was the DCM in India, and he was the High Commissioner there. And we got into some trouble there together, and then we stayed in touch. And so throughout many of my subsequent jobs, I had a chance to talk with John and benefit from his advice. And so we have forged a very strong friendship working on India and Sri Lanka and Maldives and Indonesia and many, many other places. So it's been a wonderful friendship. I'm so happy to be here today. So John, I think maybe we might start by pivoting from what David was saying about your first experience in Indonesia when you were ambassador from 1997 to 2000. And, that was such a formative time for Indonesia, both in terms of its early days of democracy, but also, so many other things that were happening. And I wondered if you've had such a long experience working in Indonesia, if you could just give us your reflections on the evolution of Australia's relations with Indonesia over that period, and we can then talk a little bit about your thoughts of the evolution of Indonesia itself as well. So, again, thanks so much for joining me.
Look, thank you very much, Bob.
There you go.
And it's really a pleasure for me to be on the USINDO board, particularly as I've had 3 assignments in Washington and started off my professional career actually as a lawyer in New York. So I have a strong sense of affiliation with the United States, but also, of course, I had 4 years in Indonesia as well as a lot of other Southeast Asian countries. So for the Australian government. Okay, let's start on the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. It's obviously significant if you just look at a map and see how Indonesia is effectively covers pretty well all the northern approaches to Australia. It's a population not too far short of 300 million now. It's a country which has developed very significantly since it became independent. And we've always had a relationship which has been in the Australian news, if not always positively. Look, it's been a pretty turbulent relationship. And it started off very well as we recognized Indonesia's independence. We're one of the first countries to do so. It went through, a few difficult periods with President Sukarno because of our sense that he was a little bit too far to the spectre of, a little bit too close to the spectre of communism, and his that sort of nationalist populist tone is of his reign caused unease in Australia. But we worked okay. Look, I think when Suharto came to power, what came to the forefront relationship with Indonesia was the fact that we do have 2 very, very different systems. Australia is a bit different to most Western democracies in terms of its external politics. If you look at comparable countries, the United States is sui generis in this. The same rules don't apply to the United States as countries. We're essentially still, although a multicultural country, a Western democracy in the way we think. And the countries that are closest to us, and with the exception of the United States, most important to us, are countries with totally different cultural, historical, religious backgrounds. So it works differently. If, for example, look at comparable countries, and 2 that I like to think about, because there is a lot in common with them, Canada is one. Much bigger, but very similar system, similar British heritage. The other country, which I just like to use because it's similar size in terms of pop and outlook, is Holland. But if you, as an example, if you look at both those countries, the countries of primary foreign policy focus are countries broadly similar systems to their own. With Australia, it's different. So there is a particular diplomatic challenge for Australia, and that's particularly appropriate or particularly apposite in relation to Indonesia. And this is a country which has, is close to us, but in every other respect almost different. So that's really a challenge. Now, when Suharto came to power, this was an authoritarian government, a government which placed huge importance in the status of the president. It's a country which was very, very conscious as an emerging, as a colony, as a country which was emerging from colonization, of its dignity and its status. And you have in Australia this very, very lively, combative democracy. And it didn't take very long for our views on authoritarianism in Indonesia, particularly the views of our press, to have an adverse impact on our. Suharto. The criticism constantly of the regime did have an impact, and it was very difficult to manage at times. Then along came Timor, and this was a classic case where we were faced with the difference between being essentially a country which had interests in Indonesia, but were influenced by our own culture. And the problem was this. Initially, we saw the incorporation of East Timor by Indonesia in positive terms in the context of our security. Remember, this was a different time. It was the 70s. However, when the manifestation took place of Indonesian authoritarianism in Indonesia, there was a constant revulsion almost of that within Australian society, which basically forced our politics in a particular direction, and meant effectively that was an area of tension until and even today we still have these issues between Australia and Indonesia, where our cultural approach to problems is just quite different to that of Indonesia. And again, the dignity issue came up very much in an incident, or set of incidents about 7 or 8 years ago, when it appeared in the Australian press that the Australians had bugged the telephones of SBY, the president, and a number of ministers. Well, this is something that you probably could have got round if it were two similar countries. But this was not an issue that was easy to get over. And it took quite a while to sort it out and sort it through and get it back to normalcy. And SBY himself was, I think, pretty helpful. But the politics between the two countries made it just awkward. But at the end of the day, the fact that by the 90s, the Timor issue had been, if not entirely resolved, at least had been considerably diminished as a problem between Australia and Indonesia with the independence of East Timor. And given the fact that with the departure of Suharto, Indonesia became a democratic country, the differences were diminished. And so we now have a relationship which doesn't have the same spark to it and problems in it. But in this business, boring is probably a good idea. In diplomacy, you don't want too much excitement. And the relationship has, I think, calmed down, and it's quite positive. There are interests in Indonesia in having an improved security relationship with Australia. We had a treaty negotiated when Keating was Prime Minister in the 90s with Suharto, and that was a pretty good treaty. That went up in smoke during the Timor crisis, but gradually the blocks have been put back into place for a more improved relationship. And that's actually working quite well. The economic relationship between Australia and Indonesia is not as good as it should be. It's actually, when you look at our figures, Indonesia is not even in the top 20 of our investment destinations. And two-way trade, we're both about sort of 10th, 11th, that sort of area with each other. So given the proximity of the two countries, that's not particularly. Okay, so the relationship is normal, I think, and much more normal than it perhaps was in the old days. The issue now, and this is, I think, something that's probably on all our minds all the time, is the degree to which there is strategic or not strategic, the degree to which we in Australia, and I bring in the United States here, are handling the overall security relationship with the region in the context of the rise of China and what the Chinese are doing. I don't propose here to get into the issue of what I think of the differences between the United States and China. There's plenty said in Australia about that. But what I do think is if you accept there is contestation between the two, and I accept that totally, you accept that we would prefer to see the United States remain a significant player in the region, and I accept that totally. What is going to be very important for the future of the contest between these two great powers is how Southeast is handled, and we have a part in that. Now, look, this is just my view, it's not an Australian view. My strong sense is, over many years now, the United States has, when it focuses on Asia, tends to focus on Northeast Asia. That's, after all, the area of traditional competition between the great powers, China, Russia, Japan, the United States, with the Korean issue in there. And that has meant that States has not put the same political energy into Southeast Asia, except over the period when contestation because of the fears in the United States of Soviet and Chinese aspirations in Southeast Asia. And that was the Vietnam War. And to some degree, it impacted on United States and Australian policy towards Indonesia in the 60s. Okay, that I think, that's sort of the overhang. And I think that's always been a deficiency in United States global policy. I'm not saying that you haven't had excellent embassies around the region, that you have very good people, but it was a question of political focus and political energy in this particular part of the world. Now, as a result of that, I think what you've seen over the last 20 years or so is an increase in Chinese influence in Southeast Asia at the expense of the influence states. And there are now, it's quite interesting that, there are a number of studies that have been taken, which have been undertaken, which effectively, I think, prove that point. Look, one, I just heard it because it's very recent. There was an article in Foreign Affairs only about 4 or 5 days ago, which showed that taking certain areas, there was a very technical term they used, which academics sometimes is what they call domains of interaction. Well, not the phrase I would have chosen, but effectively looking at a number of areas in which Southeast Asian countries dealt with the United States, a number of areas in which they dealt with China. And what that showed is quite interesting, that over the past 30 years, or yes, 25, 30 years, the Chinese influence had increased at the expense of the United States in those domains of interaction. Now, with a number of countries in Southeast Asia, it was quite clearly China that had prevailed, and those are the obvious ones: Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, to my surprise, marginally Vietnam. Then there was the one country that was clearly in the United States camp, that was the Philippines. And then there were the 4 big ones, the 4 important ones. Here's about that: Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and what was the other? Thailand, yes. Which essentially was still very much in the hedging area. But I think this is just one more indication. There have been indication surveys, other surveys, particularly out of Singapore, as well as surveys in Australia by the Institute, which is a think tank in Australia, which quite clearly show that over this period, the United States influence has diminished, and Australia, and that means Western influence, of which we're part, has diminished, and Chinese influence has increased. Now, okay, that happens, but it's quite persuasive, some of the documentation. Now, where this I think really matters is Southeast Asia is the area of greatest contestation between China and the United States. It's the most important single area, I think, of contestation between the two. You could argue about the South China Sea, Japan, but it's really Southeast. But the positions there are pretty clear. Of, say, the Japanese and the South Korea, not in Southeast Asia. And my own sense is that there is an awareness of this in Australia. But if you were the man in the moon looking down on Australian foreign policy, you'd see three main areas. One would be the relationship with the United States, the security relationship. The second would be Southeast Asia, or Asia generally, the region, what we do in the region. The third would be the multilateral, IMF, UN, regional organizations, APEC, so on. Okay, if you were the man on the moon looking down, I think that Australia had put, over the last 15 or so years, too much emphasis on the security relationship with the United States at the expense of the two other areas. I think that's a fault in Australian external policy under both parties. I think it's recognised, perhaps not in an obvious way, but it's recognised certainly in some circles in government in Australia, and we're trying to do something about it. But I think it would be quite important in terms of this contest for power, were the United States to be able to sort of take a sort of another strong look at what is happening in Southeast Asia. Okay, now where this comes back, Indonesia, how do we handle Indonesia in this sense? Look, my own view is certainly with these countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, any of those countries, you don't really get anywhere by going along to them and saying, look, you've got to think like this. You've got to be in our camp, because if you're not in our camp, you're not going to be, that's not going to be helpful. In other words, you don't want to try and force them to choose, and they go on about it. What is important, I think, however, is to try and help them develop the resilience to make up their own minds to be more assertive in the region. You can suggest that India may be sort of wanting, Indonesia may be wanting to be all things to all men. And there's that suggestion tends to come through in the way they develop their policies. But essentially, what they, I think, are looking for is not so much the same sort of relationship with everybody, but the capacity to develop relationships as they choose with both China and the United States and other major powers in the region. Now, if they can develop that capacity to pursue their interests as they see them with more vigor, that should hopefully redound to our benefit. I don't think there's a lot of sense in trying to sort of force it. So I don't think it's ever worked. I've never been in a country where that sort of approach has worked with those countries. Indonesia, of course, is the major one. Hence, I mean, this is just an example. You're hearing the odd murmur in Australia now that with President Prabowo going off to Russia, and with the Russians, a couple of months ago, talking about having planes in West Papua, there's a sort of adverse reaction. I'd basically, if I was still in government, I'd say, take it easy. This is going to happen, a bit of this. Let them figure out what they want. Anyway, look, I've probably said enough. Let me do the rest on Q&A.
Okay.
That'd be fine.
Let me pick up on your comment about how we'd like Indonesia to be more assertive. I think it's widely believed that Indonesia under President Jokowi really punched below its weight in international affairs, and Jokowi himself was very much prioritized local development, wasn't very comfortable on the international scene. But now, with the emergence of the Trump administration, the renewed U.S.-China competition, there's a whole train of thought here in Washington about how there's a group of swing states that are going to be extremely important, and U.S. and China will be looking to influence them. And they're the countries you would imagine, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Turkey and India, but Indonesia is one of them. And I think there's a growing recognition that we need to do more in Indonesia. every administration, at least up to Trump, would talk a big game about the Indo-Pacific, but invariably other crises got in the way, whether it was Ukraine or Gaza or other crises. And so they tended to crowd out our engagement in the Indo-Pacific, including Indonesia. And I'm a little worried the same thing is going to happen here with the Trump administration. It's not, they don't pay very much attention to anyone in Southeast Asia. But I wondered from the Australian perspective, do you think that your colleagues have the same perception about these important swing states and how it's going to be more and more important for Australia to be engaging them as, individually? And, of course, we need to continue to engage China and the United States. But do you all see these swing states as gaining influence over time?
And that swing states, including those outside of the particular region.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Look, from an Australian perspective, sure that we have such a broad global perspective as the United States. Sitting in Washington, for obvious reasons, you look at the world, we tend to look to the north, and very much, if we're looking to the west, it's certainly India now, and it includes India in a major way. And of course, it includes Southeast Asia as well as Japan and Korea. Look, I think there's certainly recognition and serious recognition of the importance of looking at these issues in a global context, looking at them in the context of what is happening within the BRICS, so influencing those sorts of countries. There is, our policy would very much be behind countries like Indonesia and Thailand joining the OECD now. The application processes are, they're sort of very bureaucratic, but they're sort of well down the track in the OECD. So I think that does become increasingly important. But I don't think we think, I'm repeating myself here, but I don't think we have that same global appreciation as you do. If you're sitting in there, an awful lot, rightly or wrongly, and there are different views on this, a huge amount depends on the perception of what the Chinese are doing than the broader issues. The Russia, certainly, I think the broader issues of what's happening in the Gulf, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Gaza is seen and watched very carefully, but the domestic context is very, very important in Australia rather than the international political context.
Let me ask one more question and we can open it up. You mentioned trade. I think as you look at Prabowo and what he's been doing, I think he's doing a pretty elaborate hedging strategy where, Indonesia cannot rely as much on China and the United States as they used to, because there's potential for a lot of tensions. So they do need to diversify their trading partners, and I think they're doing a pretty good job of doing that. And, but I've always felt that Australia has actually had. You mentioned that the numbers are not quite that as interesting as they could be, but I do believe that there's an opportunity now for Australia to up its game on the trade side, and I would include also the student side. Trump has taken some, I think, ill-advised decisions on foreign students here in the United States. And I hope they don't all go off to China. I'd love to see them more go to Australia and the UK. And again, I hope that's an opportunity that Australia can seize. But
okay, it's a good point. And education has long been a major plank in our relationship with Indonesia and other countries in Southeast Asia, but Indonesia very important. I just make one comment on what you've said about Indonesia's foreign policy outlook right now. It was interesting. There's an annual fiesta at the ANU in Canberra called the Indonesia Outlook Conference, and it's good. Serious people come down from Jakarta, and they're good people from Australia there too. And last year, just before Prabowo, I think, was elected actually, but it was pretty clear he's going to be. they were down, and Rizal Sukma, who was head of CSIS, and some people know it's a major think tank in Jakarta, and who had been ambassador to London, he came down and he was asked a question. He said, "What do you think Prabowo's?" Didn't quite answer it, but he said, "Look, Jokowi had, one central plank to his policy, and that was infrastructure. If you were to ask Prabowo what his central plank would be, it would be foreign policy." And I think this is right. If you look at the background of this guy, you look at his whole family background, his understanding of power. He might have been erratic, certainly in his youth, but this is, a person who was, after all, married into Suharto's family. His father was a brilliant economist. He traveled extensively, and this is a man who tried to be president 3 times before he actually made it. I mean, this is not, this is a guy who is not going to sit in Jokowi's shadow. It's just, there's no question he's going to do that. And not. There's a process of de-Jokowiization, I read, beginning to happen in Indonesia, which doesn't surprise me. But it's also a guy who wants to cut a dash, wants to be remembered historically. And part of that, given his background, is going to be external. And I don't have what he's done so far. I don't have too much criticism for the way he's gone. But I think it is important. And I think this will be manifest more as his term of office continues. On the question of trade, yes, we should do a lot more, and we've had a big study as to what we might be able to do more with Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. I hope that the Australian business community will follow up, because we haven't been adventurous in the past. We don't like taking risks. But on the issue of education, I think that's very important. Look, people are getting, you get feedback here in the United States about this, but they're getting very, very jumpy about what's happening to the universities here. And quite clearly, it hasn't taken long for stuff to come out of Singapore and Britain that, thank you very much, we'd like to take up the slack. That would be position of our universities and Canada. And then also there's quite a lot happening in Europe, teaching English a lot, in places like Germany. So I think, there will be a movement in that direction. I hope, by the way, that doesn't happen, because I think one of the major elements of positive elements of American foreign policy has been the soft power element as strictly defined. Not a lot of silly things have been written about soft power, but as strictly defined. A very positive element has been your reputation as innovators, scientists, educators. And that diminishes overseas. I think it will be a terrible pity.
All right, why don't we open it up to questions?
If you could say a little more about what you've just been talking about, the trade, in a little more detail about why exactly isn't it bigger than it is right now, given the size of the two economies. I'd be very surprised if the answer is that both countries produce goods and services that the other is not interested in buying. So there must be something else going on there. Can you say a little more about why the trade and investment relationship is not bigger than it is? Thanks.
I mean, part of the answer is actually that, look, a number of reasons, and people have a second reason why there's less investment, I think, is that the mining companies, not just the Australian mining companies, have a lot less incentive to invest in Indonesia now because of the various pieces of legislation which have gone into effect, which insist on downstream processing happening in Indonesia. So that really makes it much harder. But I think you also, I shouldn't be saying this, I wish I didn't have to say it, but I have to. The Australian the business community is not an adventurous one. They're making plenty of money in Australia, and when they invest overseas, they like it to be very safe. And so, they like it to be the UK, they like it to be, certainly Canada, the US. Japan's hard for a different set of reasons, but they're nervous about getting it. And the government continues to make the point that they should, but it doesn't sort of work. The exception is education, where we've now bring students to Australia, of course, but which appears in our export figures. But also we are investing in a major way in campuses in the countries. And Vietnam, we've had a campus in Saigon for 25 years, 20 years. But we're now doing that well, and all that's very positive. But this is one of these issues where the government goes on and on and on, but Australian business at the end of the day says it's our dollar, and it's. I hope it will get better. I mean, there are a number of things being done to try and make it better, but it's a problem.
Sarang Shidore, Director of the Global South Program at the Quincy Institute. My question to the ambassador was about Australia's identity. I mean, of course, you identified Australia as a part of the Western Bloc, and that's certainly the case treaty-wise. But if you look at the demographics of Australia, it's become more Asian origin over time. So it's about close to 20%, I believe, at this point. And there could be a natural evolution, unless resisted, of Australia sort of adopting a dual identity, of course, Western in so many ways, but also Asian or part of Southeast Asia plus in a way. One example is actually Indonesia, which is a very devout Muslim country, or Malaysia, and they have very strong views on Gaza and the Middle East. But that doesn't affect their identity as an ASEAN state, and their primary policy focus areas of action are much more in Southeast Asia than in Lebanon or Palestine, because they live there. So do you see any possibility of Australia evolving in that direction? Are there cultural resistance figures that will say, no, we have to be with England and Canada forever, sort of thing, more than any other place? Thank you.
Well, it's a good question. Let's make no mistake about this. Australia is a multicultural country now, and it's pretty good on the multicultural issues. I think I'm being fair when I say that. But in terms of its political outlook, particularly its security outlook, it's still very, very Western. If you look at Australian history and you look at the serious books that have been written on Australian foreign policy, it's interesting if you look at two that are probably the best known. The title of one is Fear of Abandonment. The title of the other is The Frightened Country. Now, this is a country which has always had, historically, a protector. We didn't have our own foreign defence policy until 1941. It was British, even though we were independent, effectively independent from the beginning of the century, beginning of the 20th century. When we were threatened by the Japanese in the Second World War, the relationship with the United States effectively made the difference. And that's pretty deep in the Australian psyche. And Australian politicians aren't going to take that on. And that's why, one of the reasons why the alliance is so important, and I think has a disproportionate role in our foreign policy. Not against it, but I think it's disproportionate. Okay. Now, is it changing? Not much. You'd think it would be. Clearly, when large-scale immigration takes place into a country, and that's happened in Australia over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly Chinese and Indian, big countries and big countries of emigration. Also Vietnam, a lot being to do with, the exodus after the Vietnam War. I just put in parentheses here. Other countries in Southeast Asia are not big emigrants, and the Indonesians are not big emigrants, at least to Australia. There are Indonesian immigrants going back to the sort of post-Dutch period in the Netherlands, but not in a major way. Okay. Sense is certainly when it comes to foreign policy and policy main approaches or main elements of a foreign policy doctrine is that those elements, that aspect of needing to be protected, an affiliation with historically countries which historically we have strong security links, isn't diminishing much. The impact on the country and the thinking of the country of immigrants coming in, this is my view on Australia, and I think it applies to other countries to some degree. The immigrants coming into the country are more influenced by the country into which they're entering than they influence the country into which they're entering, because they have to become part of it. And so you'd think, I think it could be very useful and is already useful in developing some family-to-family trading links, particularly. And you see this above all with the Indian and Chinese communities. Is it making much of a difference to our overall policy? No. It's making it a much more interesting country to live in, but I don't think it's impacted much on our external policy.
Thanks, Mr. Ambassador, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Could I ask you to talk a little bit about AUKUS in an Indonesian context? More specifically, how should both the United States and Australia manage our AUKUS relationship with Indonesia, both as in terms of bilateral relationship, but as a trilateral as well?
Probably there is some understanding with this group about what AUKUS is. I'm not sure President Trump fully understood it as a month ago. I think he probably does now, but it's essentially got two elements. One is an element by which submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, will be supplied to Australia by the United States, first of all, Virginia class, and then will be built in Australia with some American technology, but with a lot of British input. So that will be 8 nuclear-powered submarines, and it's extremely expensive and quite controversial. In an Indonesian context, I think probably there are 2 or 3 elements in it. First of all, the Deplu didn't much like it. And I think they're just uneasy about, sort of major rearmament taking, or major armament, sorry, such a major change in Australian strategic policy, with some concerns about non-proliferation issues. Those non-proliferation issues actually aren't a big deal. I think we've taken care of that. Australia is ultra conscious about non-proliferation issues, and in our own politics, we had to sort that out. And I think we basically have. My understanding is that when he was Defence Minister, Prabowo himself was quite relaxed about it. And I think probably part of this thinking is my own sense of the way Indonesia is. They may not agree with every aspect of American strategic policy, but they would much prefer to have a United States strategic presence in the region than not to have one. And I think they would see, those who thought along those lines, see some advantages in a solidification of the United States strategic relationship with Australia. Not everybody would agree. I think that view is one of the views. Some of the military in Indonesia. Look, right now, I don't think there's much thinking in Jakarta about the way AUKUS would impact on them, particularly. I think they see the United States presence as being enhanced possibly by AUKUS, but more interested in the United States presence in the region than the AUKUS element. Okay, so I think that's fairly relaxed. There will be probably noise from time. You went to New York again about some of this, about the issues of nuclear-powered submarines, but I don't get the sense it's a big deal.
My name is Bella. I'm currently a student at Johns Hopkins Science, and also I'm part of cyber agency in Indonesia. like, what's your perspective on the current set of program in administration in Indonesia? Like, the administration actually prioritized some of the programs. So what do you think, what's going to happen in terms of like domestically and also like the relations with international? In terms of like the top priorities of programs in Indonesia?
Programs, these domestic programs.
Yeah.
Look, I think there are two or three things. My sense of Prabowo, I articulated a bit earlier, but you know, he's not somebody who wants to go through term of office and just have it a sort of bland record, known certain things, as it was put to me by one very good Australian academic. It's interesting because he's got elements of the authoritarianism of Suharto, the nationalism of Sukarno, and you know, because he's got there through a democratic process, he has to sort of have a grip of that too. But this is a guy who wants his place in history, and I think that school lunch program is one of them. The Danantara Sovereign Wealth Fund, which again, you see, was an idea that came from his father, you know, years ago. The family and his background, very, very important. So those are areas where he wants to, I think, be remembered. But there are problems in this. I mean, what does he do? Because Indonesia, like all of us, has limited money. The tax base that Sri Mulyani has to work for is something like 11%. It's not enough. So as soon as you get money going into school lunch programs, and then you've got the Danantara idea as well, and then there's Nusantara, which has to be dealt with also, it's a problem. So I think one of the things that you're going to be seeing with Prabowo is he will continue to have these big ideas, but there will be a constant battle for where do you get the money from? And I think that's a real issue. And it will become more visible, I think, as his administration goes on.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm Vikram Nehru from Johns Hopkins SAIS, the same university as my colleague here. The question to you is, why should Indonesia step up its role in the region? It's being perfectly well served by the existing economic order. So what motivation should there be for Indonesia to step up its regional and global role? The second is that if it were to do that, there are really two dimensions that become important. The first is the economic dimension, which you've gone. I wanted your assessment of Indonesia's future economic trajectory. How much of a dynamic economy is this, and what needs to be done? And secondly, its projection of military power, both not just the capacity of the military, but also the military doctrine under which the military operates. So I'd like your assessment on all these 3 points. Thank you.
Nice simple question.
Yeah. Right. Okay. The whole question of why should it? That's what countries do. Once they get a taste of it, they want to get bigger. Look at what's happening in Modi's India. I mean, India's always been a major country, even though at one stage its economy made it very hard for it to live up to its aspirations. But that's getting better, and there's no question as it gets bigger, and it's the number 3 or will be economy in the world. I don't think it's going to just sort of sit there. It's going to want to do more, and I think so. That's what big countries tend to do. Is it in their interest? Yes, it's in their interest to get richer. That's something you do for your people. And the other thing countries like is being able to tell other countries what to do, and that comes with all these things. I think are in the Indonesian dynamic, and I think probably that's part of Prabowo's thinking. Will it get there? Economically, I think you can make a very good case that it will at some stage be the 4th biggest economy in the world. this is what is bandied around. It's 2045. I'm not sure of that. And I'll come back to that. But one thing, if it does come, it is going to increase. There are a couple of factors to want to bear in mind. It might be the fourth biggest economy in the world, but the other top three are going to be a lot wealthier. That's the United States, China, and India. Big difference between the United States and China and India on the one hand, and then next to India, but a long way down to Indonesia. And it will be sort of, in the mix will be countries like Brazil. So it's not, I'm not sure whether it's fifth, sixth, fourth, because I think matters a lot, but it will be a lot more powerful. But I'm not sure that it will grow as quickly as some of its most optimistic supporters and its most optimistic leaders would think it will. And look, there are several reasons for this. One, you have to bear in mind about Indonesia, it is an archipelago. That's harder. It's harder to grow an archipelago than it is a country like India. All sorts of barriers to economic growth that are, I think, quite important. Secondly, and of course Indonesia is not alone on this, there are governance issues. I mean, let's be absolutely frank about that. And that's going to impact on the way they grow. And I don't know that those governance issues are going to improve, particularly under President Prabowo. I think there are real problems with the size of the cabinet, the fact there's no opposition, the weakness of the KPK. All these things I think are going to make a difference over a period. But what I'm coming down to is I'm not necessarily in the camp which says Indonesia is going to be this enormously wealthy country in 20 years' time. But the fact is it's going to become wealthier and more important and more powerful. And we have to take that into account, I think. On the sort of their strategic outlook, look, the history, of course, is non-aligned movement. But I think and that affects the way Indonesians think. It certainly affects the way their foreign policy apparatus thinks. There is a certain tension in both your former ambassadors here tonight will know about this. There's a certain tension between those in the foreign policy establishment who place ASEAN centrality and the need for ASEAN cohesion to the top of the pile, and those who would see Indonesia taking a more independent stance from ASEAN and pushing a bit for ASEAN at the same time category. I'm not sure where Sugiya, from what I know about Sugiya, I'm not sure how much he has a particular view. But there are certain people who would like to see in Indonesia, who would like to see a more adventurous Indonesia. A person who publishes his views very, very frequently on this is Rizal Sukma, and I quote him because he is a serious intellectual figure on these issues in Indonesia, and there are a number of people who agree with him on that. So, why is it necessary? And I think the final point is it in our interest? Yes, I think it is. Indonesia's, I don't think, ever going to be a problem, an opponent for Australia. I've never believed that. I think there was a period when Australia saw this sort of great fearful country, but if you look at the degree to look at their whole, the way their military has tended to focus internally, at least until now, rather than externally, their wealth, their whole disposition, I've never seen it as a threat. I think so. A stronger Indonesia, I think, it's not a minus.
Somebody is watching this at about 3 a.m. in Jakarta. That's a good sign. As you know, Beijing's policy in the South China Sea is also bothering Australia, Australian interests. What is Australia's position, seeing Jakarta has a close relationship to Beijing and Beijing's influence in geopolitics and the region?
I think there would be a certain number of people in the Australian security establishment who would, and in the American security establishment, who would prefer Indonesia just to be one of us, in the gang. That's not going to happen. I'm realistic about that. And so I wouldn't be, again, I alluded earlier to the fact that these Southeast Asian countries, and particularly the four countries that are really more in the middle, basically, I think they don't want to be asked to choose, but I think what they're also looking for is the other side of that coin. And that is the question of, yes, they don't want to be asked to choose, but they also want to choose what they want from the relationships with various countries in the region. And they want certain things from the United States. They want certain things from China. They want certain things from Australia. They want strategic autonomy, in short. Now, I think strategic autonomy for Indonesia, if we trust Indonesia basically to follow, to pursue its own interests, that doesn't damage Australia. Because if Chinese influence were to be disproportionate in Indonesia's surrounds, we would expect them to contest that, not necessarily with guns, but to contest that. And that's fine. And if they don't like certain things we're doing or certain things the United States is doing, contest it. That's good. That works. I think overall it works in our interests. So I don't have a problem with that.
Thank you. My name is Laura McAdams. I'm on the Indonesia and Timor-Leste desk over at the State Department. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, in your view, where do the United States' interests and Australian interests diverge in Indonesia?
Look, I don't think the interests are that different, but in the sense that both countries have interests in common in Indonesia. Look, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Paul Wolfowitz years ago, who had a very strong reputation as United States ambassador in Indonesia. And I said, it was before I left Washington, and I was going from Washington to Jakarta. And I said, what was your sort of view of Indonesia from the American perspective? And he said, look, there are two major things. I mean, again, people in Washington look at the world differently to smaller countries. You've got everything to deal with, and you have to sort of think in very large chunks about what's happening. And he said, look, there are two things that are important. And he said, the first one is it's a big country in Southeast Asia, which is one of the elements that are in our interests as a balance to China. And the other is Indonesia, major Islamic country, which is in the moderate Islamic country camp. And that too has influence. So these were the big chunks. Okay. And I suspect that's the way, generally speaking, Washington looks at Indonesia. From our point of view, the China angle is also present. But there are all sorts of bilateral things to do with being neighbors and with these cultural problems as neighbors that we have. And of course, for a very long period, the Timor question was, something which was very present in American thinking, but it wasn't an overarching feature, which it was in our thinking. So I think those are the common factors. The Islamic issue, yes, but we don't think of that in the same way as thought of in Washington. It's just a different issue for us.
My name is Putrakus Darman. I was recently affiliated with the USAID contractor, so very similar to many in the room. You mentioned the mining sector briefly in an answer to my colleague's question, and I kind of want to hear your perspectives on Indonesia and Australia's position geopolitically in that space. As we all know in the room, Indonesia and Australia are major actors in the critical minerals and mining sector, always in the top 10 in global trade. However, recent situations, incidences like the Yukon Gorge, I'm sure you know, and then the most recent news coverages from Raja Ampat have showed the limitations and setbacks actors in the mining sector continue to play. So I was wondering, in terms of regulation or in the business ecosystem, how do you see Indonesia and Australia be responsible stewards and leaders in the process of critical mineral transformation? And also, how do they better position themselves geopolitically in this ecosystem, knowing full well China's interest, US interest, and the continuing level of involvement that the global communities will try to occupy? Thank you.
A lot of complicated questions in that, but let me just try and just make a couple of points in response. First of all, in terms of Indonesia as a mining environment, normally these big Western mining companies go into difficult mining environments and stay there only if the rewards match the risks and the problems. Now, if you look at this is over a period, and I'm not just talking about Australian companies, but there has been a movement by those big companies out of countries like Indonesia and the Philippines because it's just too difficult. And once it becomes too difficult, they can go off to Chile and make more money. So that's a factor. And look, the other issue is I think the big issue that you hear about, and I'm no expert on this, is the question of nickel and the Chinese capacity to effectively mine nickel and play around with the prices. We don't like that. Quite clearly, I mean, as a mining country, and we want good mining regimes everywhere, and so that's a worry. Anyway, I don't know that I can go into too much more detail because I don't have your obvious expertise on it. And
Do you see Indonesia's joining BRICS as offering a positive opportunity for Indonesia to bring together varying countries as part of President Prabowo's global strategy?
I don't know how much it's going to help bring countries together. I understand where Indonesia's coming from and joining the BRICS. The BRICS are not our gang, but nor are they all problems for Australia. I mean, there are some, quite countries that align quite firmly with the United States, some with Australia in it. If President Prabowo sees that's going to benefit Indonesian interests, I don't think we should be too worried about it. That doesn't mean to say there aren't people in the Australian government who might be, but I don't think we should be. Similarly, go back to this example of the OECD. That's essentially a Western group, and it's good is in that. I can understand a country that has aspirations to be the fourth biggest economy in the world, which has aspirations for a bigger regional and global role. And I think that is something I think Prabowo has those aspirations. It wants to be in a number of these organizations, and I don't think we should be disturbed by it. And I think, countries around, some people in my own country and maybe some in the United States get a bit excited about this. Look, I think but I'm not sure that we should be. But one thing I think we do have to be conscious of, both countries, is the growing political clout of the global South. And I think that's been ignored. And I think there's been a tendency for us to ignore the fact that they have a different perspective on Ukraine. I'm not suggesting we should change our policy on Ukraine, but they have a different perspective. There are reasons for that. They have a very different perspective on Gaza. And I think, if we constantly ignore the perspectives that are coming out of the global South, it's not in our interests. It's simply not. And it's a cold-blooded calculation of what's in our interests and what's not. And in Australia, I think, we tend to sort of, again, focus very much on, at present, on alliance issues and our own region, to the detriment of some of these broader global issues. Anyway.
Thanks, Chapman Taylor, associated with Don and Tara. Just to follow up on Putra's question, Indonesia went through a capital starvation phase when many multinational companies came in, including Australians, and they had dominant control of enterprises. As that starvation came to shortage, kind of where we are now, and as governance improved, but perhaps not enough, many of the mining companies left. And Australian companies tend to think of, business practices. When I look at the companies that have been truly successful in this very opaque environment, the two that stand out would be Freeport and Singtel of Singapore, who did not choose a control mechanism, 100% ownership mechanism. They chose an alliance mechanism. So my curiosity is whether Australian businesses can see that change in paradigm and come in and work with the right entities, because clearly in the medical services industry, there's huge demand for growth. Indeed, in capital, there's huge demand for growth. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for Australian businesses. They just have to get out of that historical mindset of control.
Yes, I think look, you put it well, and I don't disagree with some of the comments, with the gist of your comments. Look, I think the two examples, I don't know so much about Sintel, but what happened with Freeport, was very, I think it was a very big issue, and I think that was followed by a lot of people, including by ourselves while I was there, and of course since then. I think two or three things about Freeport was they had a very tough and dynamic management, and a management which was prepared to persevere. But also the rewards of the Freeport mine are very considerable. I think it's the second biggest copper mine in the world, and it's possibly the richest in terms of ore, richest big one in terms of ore. So I think, but I think those are the factors that kept it there. I mean, you would remember this much more clearly than I.
Russell King right here as well.
Yes,
lived through it all.
Yeah, so, but I think those are the two factors. And I think, should Australian companies be a bit more determined and be prepared to take a few more risks? Yes, and be a bit less conservative. Yes, sure. But that's not the real world for us.
Thank you.
Easier for a company that's been there a long time to transition over.
Yeah.
Any final comment?
Nope.
Thank you so much, Ambassador McCarthy. That's all. Thank you, Ambassador McCarthy.